To win over the girl he fell in love with at first sight, he searched through 5 neighboring states and created a vast sea of romantic flowers. But this man's very public display of affection was seen by the girl's fiancé as nothing short of blatant provocation.
This is my girl! Mine!
I wasn't aware that she belonged to anyone.
Edward clutched his bleeding nose but had no intention of fighting back because he had promised the girl he wouldn't get into a conflict with him. So instead, he received an even more violent beating.
Don! I will never marry you.
What? You mean you love this guy?
He's almost a stranger and I prefer him to you.
That beating won him the girl's heart. Blood trickled from the corner of Edward's mouth, but his smile only grew brighter. Dawn, the jilted fiancé, could only clinch the ring and walk away in defeat. Edward and the girl naturally went on to marry. But who could have guessed that this blazing love, barely sprouted, would be cut short by a national draft notice? Edward had no choice but to go to the front lines. To shorten his service and return to his beloved as soon as possible, he volunteered for the most difficult and dangerous missions. But during one reconnaissance mission, he was trapped in a North Korean military camp. The US military completely lost contact with Edward and had no choice but to notify his wife. Sandra had been day and night hoping for letters from her husband, but instead received a cold notice of his death. Hope shattered into dust in that instant. Perhaps fate loves to play jokes with cruelty as its backdrop, but it always hides a thread of tenderness within despair. After Sandra had been grieving for 4 months, a familiar yet unfamiliar figure suddenly appeared silhouetted against the drying bedsheet. Edward had returned, safe and sound. He himself had thought he was going to die, but luckily, he had encountered a pair of conjoined twins in the camp. They were performers invited to put on a show. The sisters were moved by Edward's deep love for his wife, and decided to help him return to his homeland. In return, Edward promised to get them into the American entertainment industry, and so, they traveled thousands of miles, and finally returned to his wife, who had been pining for him day and night, devastated by grief. But the peaceful life didn't last long. Edward's innate adventurous spirit began to stir again. He simply loved challenging the impossible. A mysterious legend circulated in the small town. In the nearby river, there was a giant fish that was the reincarnation of a thief's ghost. Countless anglers had spent their whole lives trying to catch it, but none had succeeded. But Edward had a stroke of insight. Since the giant fish was formerly a thief, ordinary bait would surely not interest it. Without hesitation, he took off his wedding ring. To his surprise, the giant fish actually took the bait. Edward accomplished this impossible challenge, but he soon discovered that it was a pregnant female about to give birth. His heart couldn't bear it. He chose to take back the ring, and then released the mother back into the wild. Coincidentally, at almost the same moment, good news came from the delivery room. Sandra had given birth to their son, Will. This giant fish, which had witnessed his faithful love, became a recurring character in Edward's stories from then on. Even at his son's wedding, he would vividly tell the tale. The surrounding guests all loved this fantastical and romantic story, but Will alone was deeply annoyed by these stories. He couldn't understand why his father was so obsessed with telling such fabricated tales. After a huge argument, Will moved far away with his wife. Father and son had no contact for 3 full years, until a letter from his mother broke the impasse like a boulder crashing into still water. His father had cancer and didn't have much time left. Will and his wife didn't dare delay for a moment. They flew back home overnight. A little boy on the plane, playing with hand shadows, opened the box of Will's childhood memories. His father had once played with him like that, weaving fantastical worlds with hand shadows. It was said that when Edward was young, a mysterious witch lived deep in the swamp. She had a unique glass eye, through which others could see the moment of their own death. A group of children didn't believe it, so they walked through the forest together and arrived at the door of her cabin. Edward politely stated his intention. To everyone's surprise, the witch agreed readily. She lifted her eye patch, revealing her white glass eye. When the other children saw their futures through her eye, they were terrified and ran away. Only Edward looked into the witch's eye without fear, and after learning how he would die in the future, he was no longer afraid of anything. As a young man, Edward was warm-hearted. Not only did he rush into a burning building to save a dog, but he also excelled in all kinds of sports, becoming a big man on campus in his small town. But the little town of Ashton could no longer contain Edward's ambitions. Then one day, something strange happened. Something unknown was destroying the town's farms. Sheep were disappearing from their pens. The terrified townspeople demanded answers from the mayor. But while everyone was at a loss, Edward stepped forward. The confidence the witch had given him made him believe he would not be in danger. So he went alone to the cave to negotiate with the monster. He was willing to sacrifice himself for the town, and volunteered to be the offering. But the other party was clearly not interested. The clumsy giant was too hungry and couldn't find food, so he had resorted to stealing sheep from the village. Edward told him that perhaps it wasn't that he was too big, but that this town was too small. Edward described the wider world beyond the town, and invited him to come see it. This sincere conversation moved the giant. Edward solved the town's problem, and at the same time embarked on his long-desired journey. There were 2 roads out of town. One was a brand new, smooth smooth road. The other was an abandoned, thorny path. Edward, who loved adventure, chose the unknown path, and arranged to meet the giant at the end of the road. However, after many hardships along the way, Edward accidentally stumbled into Spectre. It was a lush, green place, like a paradise. But strangely, many pairs of shoes hung on the clothesline at the village entrance. The people of the town lived carefree lives, seemingly without any worries. Everyone who came here never wanted to leave. But just as Edward tried to join in their rhythm, a little girl suddenly snatched his shoes. He immediately chased after her, but still couldn't stop her from throwing his shoes onto that clothesline, taking away the shoes that symbolized faraway journeys. This was a comfort zone designed to make people stay. A happy town that made ambitious young people stop their journeys. Here, Edward also met a former townsman. Nort had been a poet in Ashton. It was said he had gone to a romantic city, but he had actually settled here. And during his conversation with Nort, Edward unexpectedly discovered something frightening. The poet, who had once been famous in Ashton, had written only 3 lines of poetry in the 12 years he had lived here. Edward sensed that something was wrong. Comfort can consume a person's imagination. This village, which seemed to party every night, could leave one's soul feeling empty if you stayed too long. So he announced to everyone that he was leaving. The mayor asked him why, puzzled. Edward admitted that life in Spectre was truly desirable, but this was not his place. There were still many places in this world he hadn't seen. Despite the mayor's repeated attempts to keep him, Edward didn't look back, and left under the cover of night. The thorns and stones along the way never stopped him. Finally, at daybreak, Edward reunited with the giant at the crossroads. Although Will's ears had grown calloused from these stories, his wife was very interested, especially in how her father-in-law and mother-in-law had fallen in love. So Edward told the love story of his youth in detail. After meeting the giant, he arrived in the city, and happened upon a circus performance. When the ringmaster summoned a bald giant, the audience was shocked, but Edward looked unimpressed. He whistled and called out the giant Carl, showing these people what a real giant looked like. This silenced the entire venue. After the circus performance, the audience began to file out, but Edward's attention was suddenly caught. Legend has it that when you meet the love of your life, time stops. Edward knew this was the other half that fate had arranged for him. He made his way through obstacles, wanting to connect with the blonde girl before him, but just as he reached her, the frozen time suddenly resumed its flow, too fast to grasp, and Edward lost the chance to talk to her. Fortunately, the ringmaster knew this girl, so Edward began working for the circus for free, working hard day and night, with the only compensation being one piece of information about the girl each month.
Her favorite flowers are daffodil.
She's going to college.
3 years passed in the blink of an eye. Edward gradually learned everything about the girl he loved. That night, he couldn't wait any longer. He decided to go to the ringmaster's trailer and ask for the girl's name and address. Unexpectedly, a wolf lunged out from inside. It turned out the ringmaster was a werewolf. At this critical moment, a clown nearby raised a gun and aimed at the ringmaster. Edward immediately stepped in to stop him. The bullet grazed his shoulder, but thankfully missed anything vital. Edward picked up a tree branch to defend himself, and accidentally discovered that the ringmaster seemed to really like it. And so, he played with the ringmaster all night. When dawn came, the ringmaster was moved by Edward's sincerity. He told him everything about the girl. Edward traveled a great distance to the girl's university, holding the daffodils she loved, ready to confess his love. But when he saw Sandra, he found she was already engaged. Edward's first reaction was not disappointment, but disbelief. He couldn't believe that the girl fate had chosen for him would be someone else's wife. He refused to let his destiny be rewritten by others.
Sandra Templeton, I love you and I will marry you!
So Edward pursued her relentlessly, whether it was secretly replacing the teacher's PowerPoint with his own love confessions, or having a pilot skywrite a declaration of love over the school. He used every means possible, just to make Sandra see his true heart. In the end, Edward married the girl he loved. His father-in-law's story moved his wife. She complained to her husband for not telling her these things sooner, but Will insisted that his father was just bragging. That day, Sandra asked her son to help clean out the back shed. While sorting through old letters, Will unexpectedly found his father's death notice.
Not everything your father says is a complete fabrication.
Hearing this, the ice in Will's heart began to melt. His father's return had truly been a miracle. He looked through the documents there, and unexpectedly found a stack of yellowed property deeds. The address on them was precisely Spectre, the place his father always talked about. This completely piqued Will's curiosity. He wanted to verify the truth of his father's stories, so he immediately drove to the address on the deed. Although the beautiful scenery from the story wasn't there, the village did exist. Will found the person whose name was on the deed, Jenny. She was the girl who had stolen his father's shoes back then. She told Will that Edward had come to Spectre twice. The first time was by accident. The second time was when he was already successful and passed through again. But the village was no longer as it once was. Some houses were even tilting. From her, Edward learned what had happened. A road had been built, connecting to the outside world, and with it came bank mortgage loans. The financial crisis had wiped out the residents' savings. The bank was forced to put the entire village up for auction. Edward couldn't bear to see this former paradise in such a state, so he emptied his savings and bought the whole village. Will didn't believe it. His father was not rich. How could he possibly have had that kind of money? Jenny smiled and explained. Edward had mobilized almost almost all his connections. With his descriptions of Spectre, he had convinced a group of outsiders to help, but the most crucial person was the former poet, Nort. Edward's courage to leave had inspired him. Not long after, Nort also left Spectre. As it happened, they ran into each other in Texas. Nort said he had given up writing and become a bank robber, and Edward had been forced to become his accomplice. But because the bank went bankrupt, they came back empty-handed. However, inspired by Edward, Nort went to Wall Street to seek his fortune. He caught the wave and became a tycoon. To repay Edward for his advice, Nort gave him a large sum of money to go back and rebuild his hometown. Edward saved the dying village, and because of this, Jenny developed feelings for him. But in Edward's world, women were only divided into two types: his wife, Sandra, and all other women. He firmly rejected Jenny's confession. This made Will's heart ache with a bitter realization. Perhaps he had been misunderstanding his father all along. Meanwhile, Edward was hospitalized as his condition worsened. Will returned overnight when he heard the news. Seeing his father lying motionless, he began to complain about him hiding the truth and making up stories. The doctor, who had been Edward's friend for many years, heard this and told him the truth. Sandra had actually been a week early, and Edward had been away on business at the time, so he had missed his wife's labor. It was the biggest regret of his life. That was why he had invented the story of catching the giant fish, using a fantastical way to make up for that loss. And most of his experiences had actually happened. He had just added a touch of magical realism. Will finally understood that the stories he had always considered absurd were never meant to satisfy vanity. They were his father's most romantic way of expressing his love for life and his care for his family. Late that night, Edward suddenly opened his eyes. He knew his time was near. He kept asking his son to tell him about the vision in the witch's eye. And so, in his father's final moments, Will used his deepest love to complete the last chapter of his father's life fairy tale. In the story, his father miraculously rallied. He carried his father out of the hospital. The giant Carl cleared the blocked road for them. When they reached the river, all of Edward's friends had gathered. Time seemed to rewind, reviewing his entire life. They were not sad. Everyone smiled as they said goodbye to Edward.
Bye, everybody. Farewell. Adieu.
Unlike the time he stood in the field of daffodils, this time it was Sandra waiting for Edward in the river. This was where the story began, and it was also Edward's final act. He took the wedding ring from his mouth, as if holding an entire lifetime, and gently placed it in his lover's palm. Watched over by all his friends, Hugh was gently placed into the water by his son. The next moment, he transformed into a giant fish, carrying a lifetime of love and legend, swimming contentedly into the distance. And in reality, Edward passed away without regret. Soon, the day of the funeral arrived. Will met, in person, the people from his father's stories. The ringmaster had no wolf fur. The giant's body was not as exaggerated as in the tale. The conjoined twins were just an ordinary pair of twins. From these people, Will heard many different stories about Edward. He was a poor young man who dared to pursue love. He was a hero who saved Spectre. He was a visionary with keen insight. Will finally understood his father and made peace with the past. Years later, Edward's fantastical stories continued to be passed down through his grandson's lips. He vividly told the tale of the mysterious giant fish, of his grandfather's legendary life. Some stories are never meant to deceive. They are meant to let love continue.